All right. So this is the first of a series of short lectures that I'm going to do on end-of-life issues, things like right to die, assisted death, um, advance directives, living wills, all of those things that come into end-of-life decision-making. This is on the tail end, right, of us talking about should older adults be allowed to make their own decisions, and when, if so, should they not be able to, and should we protect them? This is sort of an extension of that, because in a lot of ways, the same concepts are reaching over into just a single domain, which is end-of-life care. Although there are some bigger issues here, it's also one that we face as aging professionals to think about how we feel about end-of-life issues, about assisted death, about people's right to die, their right to a good death. And many of us who are working in long-term care settings, who are working with older olds and older adults, are going to face some of these issues. Certainly if you're a healthcare provider, and depending on what the state laws are, you may be faced with some of these things. In fact, I just wanted to bring this up. As we've seen different states legalize assisted death, and those laws come into practice, such as in California and Oregon, and Montana has a somewhat limited version of that, and other states. I've seen a lot of kind of chatter on some of my listservs as a psychologist. It becomes one of those things that we're asked to evaluate if someone is competent or not to make these decisions about how to end their life or not. So it used to not be, because you used to not be able to make that choice. However, it's becoming a similar process to, can they drive? Can they make their own medical decisions? And psychologists, neuropsychologists, psychiatrists, the people who have typically done competency evaluations are being asked to do assisted death competency evaluations, which is an interesting area to get into, and split professionally, I think. In fact, there was just something on the list served tonight, argument, if you will, between people about if we should be talking about this in certain perspectives and values or not. And anyway, just a snippet. So these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about. And tonight I want to start out with a broad overview of the issues around right to die, and some of the kind of seminal cases that are behind some of these issues, and really the concept of a good death, or in the search for a good death and what that means. Okay, so what is a good death? If you didn't know, euthanasia, the term euthanasia, is actually means a good death, which I think it's taken on definitely a different flavor in our society for sure. But euthanasia essentially is a good death. And the question that sort of is behind a lot of this is, what is a good death? For a lot of people, a good death is a very personal concept for sure, and it's defined by each person. What types of things make a good death for you versus me might be very different. In general, I think when we think about a good death, people think about dying without pain and dying with people by their sides. And an article by Ken Murray that I didn't have you guys read it suggests that the people's biggest fears when they face dying are pain and dying alone. Most people say that they want to die at home and they want to die without pain. They want to have people around. Those are the most typical scenarios that we hear when we think about what is a good death for people. In some ways, we do have our own autonomy, or the self-determination to be able to say, this is how I want it to happen. Certainly dying at home can be a choice. I would rather not die here. Please take me home. Just depends on the situation. I don't want to have any more pain. Could I please have more pain medications? That's certainly something that you can do. But there are a lot of limits to our autonomy around how we die. Even if you have a DNR, or do not resuscitate order, or an active living will, that's no 100% guarantee that those wishes are going to be followed, particularly if you're kind of out of it when they're, reviving you or bringing you back or doing curative types of procedures. So some of the other limits to our autonomy are assisted death, right? So in a lot of states, that's not legal. So people who would wish to end their life perhaps prematurely from what they would naturally die because they have maybe an irreversible condition or their quality of life is low, that's a limit because a lot of people can't make that choice. If you didn't write your wishes down, that's one thing that we'll talk about, right? So if we don't know what your what substituted judgment for you would be because we've never written it down or talked with someone about it, we can't make those judgments. And when we become incapacitated, right, which was a big deal last chapter, right? So if we're found to have mental incapacity and not able to make our own medical decisions, oftentimes that will be one of them. You don't have the right to choose whether or not we take out the feeding tube, we take out the breathing tube, we, take away life-sustaining or don't give you life-sustaining procedures because either you're incapacitated, unable to communicate that, etc. So there are definitely some limits to our ability to define what a good death and to enact what a good death would be for ourselves. Right. So this sort of brings up the issue of what do medical professionals think? Having been on the other side of the life-saving instead of having your life saved, saving the lives of others, what do doctors think about life-saving procedures as opposed to more of a palliative approach or an approach of withdrawing or withholding treatments? So do doctors think life-saving measures are part of a good death? What might be a common scenario, although we've talked a little bit about that with people wanting to die at home, people wanting to have pain medication only, and perhaps in the heat of the moment, either being incapacitated or not having communicated your wishes, you are resuscitated, you are given curative treatment. What is the role of the doctor? So you can see from this graph, and I'm going to bust in on this a little bit so you can see closer. This was a study that was done, a cohort of doctors, and they were in their about 60s at this time. So it was about 1,000 doctors who were pulled in the late 90s. They said, what types of measures would you like at the end of life? And I hope that you can see this because all of these black lines, these stark black lines with the vast majority of doctors are no, I would not want this, right? So if we think about the laundry list of life-saving procedures that people can have, most doctors have been on the other side and seen the effects of these, their efficacy, lack of efficacy of many of these to prolong a good life. And they're like, I don't want CPR, I don't want ventilation, I don't want dialysis, I don't want chemotherapy, I don't want surgery, down the line. Instead, we get to the end with, I want pain medication. It shoots up to, yes, I would want it. So this is the perspective of the medical professionals who've been on the other side. In a lot of times, doctors who are thinking about their own care will make these types of declarations, but then when they're in the moment sort of, or under that, Hippocratic oath, or in that mindset of, I'm a doctor, I fix things, it may be different, right, for what they would want for a patient who they see who might be crashing or needing life-sustaining measures. However, a lot of them still retain this in some form and will comply with wishes if they agree to comply with wishes, or if they don't agree to comply with someone's wishes to not have life-sustaining procedures, they have an obligation to refer them to someone else. It's a hard thing to do to address. Doctors end up being kind of enablers in some ways, trying to find a way to address the wishes of the family, being the confidant, the the hero, the saving force, the life force, if you will, as a doctor. These are all sort of roles that are in conflict when you're trying to address these things at the end of life. They're also victims of a litigious system, right? So they worry that even if this was a wish of a patient and the patient may no longer have capacity, and the family is really pushing for a life-saving procedure, that they may be on the bad end of a lawsuit if they don't do what the family would want, and that might lead them to comply. So, it's not easy being on the other side either, even though you know what it's like and you know what those procedures are like and their efficacy and the negative impact they might have on an older adult, such as breaking bones, breaking ribs, being against wishes, extending a life that maybe isn't very high quality, that they maybe wouldn't have wanted. It's a compelling environment sometimes to be the saving force. Okay. So is there a right to die? Do individuals have a right to die in some ways? So I want to transition now to show you a poll that I did with last semester's seminar class, where I asked them a bunch of questions that were related to right to die. And I just want to go over some of those. So I'm going to switch screens here. New share. Okay, so I'm going to show you here some of the questions that I asked them. Okay, so in this case, the first question that I asked them was, what kind of prognosis is necessary for a right to die decision to be enacted? And you can think about this too. What would you say? And when you think about someone's right to take their own life, and then you can look at some of the results here. Lots of people saying terminal, one person saying amputee. As long as they're of sound mind, so capacity comes in, terminal, or irreversible, which are different things. Irreversible, terminal, only when terminal, incapacitated. So lots of those things. Terminal, 6 months to live. That was the majority of our students. So a follow-up question that I wanted to ask them was, should we allow people to choose to withhold life-saving treatments? So let's say that they meet that right to die enacted, they have capacity, and they're either terminal or have an irreversible condition. Should we allow them to withhold life-saving treatments? All of the people said yes, we should allow them to withhold. Interestingly, though, when you look at it from a different perspective, the students still said, yes, we should allow them to withdraw life-saving treatments, but this can be a line for some people when we're talking about your right to choose a good death, whether you want to say, I don't want them in the first place, versus I want to take them away, right? Which can be a little bit different for people. Okay. So we also asked, should we allow people to choose to withdraw or withhold food or water at the end of life? So this was a slightly different result, although again, the majority of people are saying yes. Some people are like, no, that's going too far. I can understand a ventilator, something like that, but not sustenance. That's not something that we should allow people to withdraw or withhold. But these are all different types of choices that are able to be made in the end of life. Should we allow people to withdraw breathing assistance? Again, majority yes. And the vast majority yes. Should we allow people to withhold life-saving medications at the end of life? So most of those things were very similar, except the food and water for this group. Right, here's a different one. So this is the case which I'll go over a little bit about substituted judgment. If the individual is unable, should we allow a partner, family to act with substituted judgment in cases of end-of-life treatment? So you may or may not be thinking of some popular cases that you have in mind. I'll go over one of those, but only if there's evidence of what the person would have wanted, yes or no. So in that case, when we talk about acting in substituted judgment, what would this person have said? There's a couple of different scenarios. You can either know exactly what they said because they wrote it down or they communicated that and it was witnessed, or you have to surmise it. And those are very different situations. And those are very different court cases. So that was the basic poll that we had. I'm going to go back here to the slide presentation. All right. So here's just kind of a review of some of the terms that I just went over. When we're talking about a right to have a good death, the right to die, there are a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, in the Patient Self-Determination Act of 1990, or PSDA, this was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1990. It was effective December 1st in 1991, required that many hospitals, nursing homes, home health agencies, hospice providers, etc., provide information about advanced care directives to adult patients upon their admission. So it doesn't apply to individual physicians, so in a clinic and an individual physician, but as an organization and some specific types of providers like hospice providers, you have to provide information about an advanced directive at admission. So that's one thing that we've made advances on in our right to have a good death, is to help patients understand that this is their right if they're in certain types of situations, that you can say these things ahead of time. Some of the different terms that you've heard me talk about that are in your book when we talk about right to die is there's passive euthanasia and there's active euthanasia. And usually there's a pretty big split. And there's definitely a big legal split in how people discuss these. So an example of passive euthanasia is withholding or withdrawing life-saving care or end-of-life curative care. So that's passive euthanasia. That's legal, right? That's something that if the person requests it, I don't want my ventilator, I don't want my life-saving medications, I don't want this or that, that's, the doctor, if they're, those wishes are communicated, should be obligated to comply. And if they don't want to, they have to refer that person to someone else. And then there's active euthanasia, which is very different. Active euthanasia is an example of you giving a lethal dose of medication. So that's assisted death, really. So there's a pretty big split between those. In fact, a lot of people say that there is a big distinction between that, and a big distinction, but not only between passive and active euthanasia, but within passive euthanasia, a big distinction in whether or not you're asking me to withhold treatment, like I'm never giving you a feeding tube, I'm never giving you a respirator, or whether you're asking me to, after I've given that to you, to take it away. Or to be taken off of it. So there's some thin slicing here on that, but there's, just that there are different terms at play. My question is, there's a slight gray area in these. It might seem quite obvious at the front, like, well, of course you're not actively killing somebody, so that's passive if you're just withholding and withdrawing. But there's a lot of question in the ethics around this, the professional ethics as well as philosophically, of are these two that different? So when a doctor is doing active, he's taking an action with the intention that will eventually cause the patient's death. But couldn't the same thing be said for passive euthanasia? So if I'm withholding or withdrawing a treatment, I'm taking an action that has the intention that will eventually cause the patient's death. It's just a different action, both requested by the patient at some point, either through substituted judgment best interest, or they've, communicated that to me and they're competent. So that's my challenge for this for you is, how are they different? And even though we feel more comfortable with passive euthanasia, and certainly more, it's legal versus not legal in a lot of states, active euthanasia, what are the real differences, morally and ethically, certainly about those two? And what types of life-sustaining treatment should be able to be decided upon as well, right? So we talked about how people were a little bit hedging around food and water and taking that away or not giving that, breathing, different medications, having CPR, all types of life-sustaining treatments that may or may not be part of a good death for someone. And in a passive euthanasia phase, they have the right to be able to say, I don't want that. So again, I asked them, when should we be able to decide? When should you be able to say, well, guess what? I don't want to do this anymore. So take this away or don't give me that. So one of the cruxes here and legally that I want to bring up is whether or not you're talking about a terminal condition or an irreversible condition, because those two are very different. Irreversible condition can be something like a coma, right? Low brain activity, something that we would consider not quite life or maybe less than living. This is an irreversible condition, like a persistent vegetative state. So this is the famous case of Terri Schiavo, if you've heard of that. It was a case that was all over the news in my goodness, I'm going to say the 90s, and then it was probably spanned much more time than that, because when her family initially wanted, or her husband initially wanted her to be taken off of life-sustaining measures or feeding tube, and her family was very opposed to it. It was very early, but the long drawn-out court case was years and years before they eventually were able to take out her feeding tube. So that would be something like someone who's in a pervasive vegetative state, a coma that they are not going to come back from. That's different than terminal. So when we think about encouraging people to fill out advance directives and talking about living wills, you need to make sure you do that. And in fact, there was a case where they were trying to find out if a woman who had actually a living will, she had said, well, if I'm ever terminal and like this, then I don't want to have these things. So the family was trying to enact this. In fact, she was just in an irreversible state. So there was some balking at that had to go to the courts. And eventually they did comply with wishes in this state because of a proxy who had been appointed, who had said, yes, this is what we want for this woman. But because she didn't say irreversible and terminal, it wasn't considered her wish or substituted judgment for her. So let me clear up what substituted judgment is. Substituted judgment and best interest are legal terms. So the U.S. Supreme Court, many state courts have found that our right to refuse treatment can be exercised by another person on our behalf. When where no family is present, sometimes the courts will rely on a designated spokesperson who represents an interest, like a great friend or a neighbor or a trusted person for the incapacitated person. So if you're in a persistent vegetative state, you're in a terminal state, you don't have capacity to make decisions, we can enact one substituted judgment. What would this person have wanted under these conditions, right? So, but the kicker is that there's a potential problem here, is that we have to have some kind of evidence to base the substituted judgment on, right? A previous living will, an advance directive, a recorded conversation, a witness that says this in fact was their wishes, right? And it has to cover their state. So in the case what I was talking about before, if you said terminal, but you meant terminal and irreversible, and the irreversible, if you're in an irreversible state, this substituted judgment act may be in question. Also, we have best interest, and best acting in your best interest is what would a reasonable person want under these conditions. And that's also we're able to, the courts are able to, in cases where these sticky situations come up, act in the best interest of someone. Oftentimes when a proxy is doing this, they're acting in a best interest, or a guardian or a substitute decision maker, they're acting in the best interest or have to be proven to acting in the best interest of that person. So the thing that we're worried about here, because all of this is pretty sticky, right? So all of this is very sticky. If you think about all of the different court cases where people were trying to remove people from ventilators, like Karen Ann Quinlan, who was one of the very first ones that you can read about in your book. The family wanted to do this, but again, they had to prove that there was substituted judgment, or that this was in the best interest. And why are people worried about this? Why are we so specific about what has to go on and what has to be termed okay before we allow someone to be taken off of our withholding life-sustaining measures? Well, one of the reasons is it's an irreversible decision, right? So it shouldn't be an oops moment in these decisions. And the other thing is that they're worried about, in some ways, this idea that, well, if we don't put up all these safeguards and we don't make sure that to the letter someone said that this is what they want, or that a proxy is in fact acting in best interest, is we're just going to start killing off people, right, as they get older. Oh, well, they're not really doing much. We don't necessarily need them around. I'm the substitute decision maker, so, okay, take them off. So there's a little bit of a worry about geronticide, they call it, which is a stupid term, but the idea of abusing this, or making all these older terminal patients, just taking them off of life support. So that's one other reason why we're safeguarded against it. Okay. So this is a sticky situation. There are a lot of scenarios that are like this that are out there that are happening in the courts, where people are trying to either withdraw treatment from loved ones for certain reasons because it's in their best interest, or they believe it's a substituted judgment, and really getting in and defining those and what that person really thought is a good death is the sticky part of all of these court cases. And of course, in the case of Terry Schiavo, which drug out for years, you probably have some dissenting opinions amongst family, between family members, that might be causing some problems. Or in the case of some of these that you'll read in your book, a worry on the side of the provider that they don't want to do this for fear of things like litigation or being seen as they're not doing something right, where they need some concrete, absolute evidence that this would be what the person wanted and this is okay. So the courts are convened and jump in and assist with the decision. So this brings up our next topic, which I'll go over next time, which is advanced directives, right? So if we want to avoid a lot of the hassle that comes in, both from trying to surmise what we would have wanted in the end of life and trying to say, well, I don't know if they'd want to be on a ventilator, if they'd want to have life-sustaining medications, or if they'd want to be resuscitated, or if they'd want food and water, if they can't feed themselves. This is why we have things like advanced directives. And we're going to talk a lot about these next time, and what they can do, what they can't do, the limits of them are, but the importance of putting these into place before you get to the point where you aren't able to express your wishes to those that will probably be making decisions for you. So that's a preview. If you already weren't caught up in the complexity of this, But I would encourage you to look into the text, into some of the key court cases that illustrate some of these issues, and really think about it from also a personal perspective, which you'll be asked to do next week in the Living Will assignment, is to think about what your feelings are about some of these issues. And some of the slides that I went through on the poll, well, what do I think about withdrawing food and water? Do I feel like withdrawing and withholding are the same thing? How different are passive and active euthanasia? What would be a good death for someone? And where is our right as an external person to them to either assist or not assist, or help them think through some of these things? So all right, so that's our first foray into the right to die stuff, and next time we'll go over some things about advanced directives. All right, have a good couple of days.